We're here with my friend and hero, Alberto Ibargüen, the CEO of the Knight Foundation, the former publisher and CEO of the Miami Herald. He's now, among other things, on the board of the National Museum of the American Latino.
Thank you.
On my left is Aida Levitan. She is the chair of U.S. Century Bank, the first Cuban American woman chair of a U.S. commercial bank. AJ D'Amico, who is at the Knight Foundation as director of the Center for Media and Democracy, and a lawyer, having been a practicing lawyer here in Miami. And Sam Verdeja, the editor and author of Cubans: An Epic Journey, 800 pages of everything you want to know about Cuban Americans in Cuba.
Second edition.
And this is the second edition. So thank you all for being here and being a part of this conversation. And I want to start out, because you're all representatives of this, and ask a question for all of you. Cuban Americans, the Cuban exile community, and all the Cuban Americans have been one of the great success stories in the history of American immigration. What's the reason for that?
Well, I think it started with the first wave of Cuban exiles, which came from the upper and middle class, very educated and professional classes of Cuba. So they came already with relationships in the United States. They came with, many of them, with the ability to speak English and with a very entrepreneurial spirit. And they established businesses and professions that they revalidated their degrees and so on. And I think they created a foundation for the other waves of Cuban exiles that would establish an economic foundation for them to take advantage of. So that's one reason.
Sometimes called the golden generation of Cuban exiles.
No, and not just for the next few waves of Cuban immigrants and exiles, but also the next generation of Cuban Americans like myself. I think this is the only city in the world, and Cubans are some of the only immigrant and exile communities in the country where they had the blueprint from their parents. They see success on buildings, on streets, in their communities, and in their families, and in their friends' networks as well.
Miami is the only large American city in which is a majority foreign-born, which makes Miami a very interesting city with Cubans as leaders in that. And Sam, in your book, you've got a long list, and pictures of all the Cuban success stories, the entrepreneurs, the businessmen and women have been so successful in this country.
Well, in my case, I think it represents the first wave that is called the historic, among ourselves. Yeah. It sounds a little bit, but we call it the historic group of exiles, which is the first 20 years. And I came, as I say, running, because I had the advantage of having an education in the United States. My family sent me to the United States in 1956 BC, before Castro, and had the advantage of having the language and having the know-how of the United States. And that's what Aida says. The key year was 1965, 1966, when the period who was called the suitcase period. We all were ready to go back to Cuba, but something happened. Suddenly, the President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev agreement came out saying the United States will not invade Cuba, will not allow the Cubans from the United States to do it. And we realized that we are here to stay. And that was, I believe, in my judgment, what really put everybody to say, hey, if whatever we know we are going to be here. We have to do it.
And Alberto, the Knight Foundation has been very important in funding the arts in Miami, and you've been a part of that culture. It seems that there's a huge Cuban influence, and it's across all the arts, all the art forms.
Well, there can't not be a Cuban influence. At one point, some 65% of the county of Miami-Dade is Hispanic, and at least half of that is Cuban American. So of course there's a Cuban influence to virtually anything that you do in this town. I think one of the things that all three of my friends have suggested, but that really ought to be highlighted, is that there's a big difference between an exile, a concept of exile and the concept of immigration. And I think when I did not live here during that golden age. I came in the mid-90s. Sam was one of my first friends here, and Aida as well. But one of the things I realized is that this was a community of people who had no apology. There was no, I've come to join the other team. It was, I'm here for the time being. I'm as good as you are. Deal with it.
Yeah.
And it was a community of very proud strivers. It was a very different kind of community from an immigrant community that has made a choice to go and stay. That really makes a huge difference. The other thing that made a huge difference, I think, is that after Mariel, Jorge Mascanosa insisted on the concentration of Cubans in Miami, which gave an already rising economic group the political numbers to basically run the town.
And there's an interesting, of course, the Freedom Tower itself is kind of interesting from your point of view, Alberto, because originally it was James Cox who created Cox Enterprises and a newspaper man and failed presidential candidate. And the tower was built to be the tallest building in the South as headquarters of his newspaper empire.
And a replica of the
Giralda Tower
in Seville. In Spain. Sam, did you ever work there? Or did you work in there?
No, I never worked in that. They moved with the Miami Herald in 1966.
When they did the joint
operating agreement.
And the interesting thing about the Freedom Tower is sort of the symbol of this particular immigration, in that we are so committed to freedom and to fighting against dictators. And this is where we're devoted to the Declaration of Independence. Freedom to us is very special because we have experienced what it's like to live in an autocratic regime that persecutes people for their beliefs and for expressing them, and that puts them in jail, even to today, where there's 1,000 political prisoners in Cuban jail simply because they participated in a peaceful demonstration. So I think this whole idea of freedom is a very characteristic aspect of the Cuban exile community and the Cuban Americans also.
And I think one of the things that we have proven is what is the American dream. And it is given the opportunity. If you have the hard work, the talent, and the values, you can achieve your dreams. And I think that's very important. I think, and that's why most Cubans that I know are very appreciative of the opportunity that this country gave us for our freedom. And we haven't given up the struggle, the fight for, even that we have been successful here, we still are struggling to see democracy and freedom in Cuba.
I think there's also something that's often not, I agree with what you just said. There's also something else that really does need to be said, and that is that there was a government policy of open door and support. Later came the Cuban Adjustment Act, but from the beginning, there was a government attitude that said, we want these people in, even while the society often would reject, because there were so many Cubans that came at the same time. And there are plenty of instances of no dogs, no Cubans allowed in this restaurant and all that stuff. But the government policy was one of bringing people in and of support. And I think that was critical. I really do think that the political genius of Jorge Mascanosa in seeing the value of the grouping of people here, concentration of people here, though, is one of the things that just led to the inevitable election of so many Cuban public officials that still are the ones who are so important in the governance of South Florida.
So, and there's an interesting timeline here about immigration too, that all immigrants may owe something to Cuban Americans, Cuban exiles. We didn't pass the generous and liberal immigration law until 1965. And Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the document on Ellis Island in October of 1965, referenced the Cuban experience and said explicitly, well, we are now welcoming all Cuban refugees. The success of the Cuban exiles as early as 1965 had something to do with the passing of the immigration law, at least from Lyndon Johnson's point of view.
And you have to give credit to before the Cuban experience in 59, 60, 61, Nicaraguans were already here in exile, and that was also the beginning of an exile mentality to the Latin American community here. And then subsequently, there are lots of others from Colombia, from Venezuela, who came exiled after Chavez and because of the disturbances in other countries. And it's fascinating to see the demographic map of Miami-Dade County. It's 5% Hispanic in 1960. It's something like 50%, 49, 50% somewhere in the 90s. And then it's 65, maybe even more today.
But one of the interesting things about how Cubans transformed Miami is that they saw the geography of Miami, and not only Cubans, by the way. Maurice Ferré, who was mayor of Miami, he was from Puerto Rico, but he saw what the Cubans saw, which is the geography of Miami made it the ideal place to become the bridge to Latin America.
Perfect.
And we started building these ties, these economic ties to Latin America.
And relative to other large American cities, Miami is so young. It's only 127 years old, 126 years old, compared to a New York or a Boston that are more than 300, almost 400. So the Cuban exile and the influx of Latin American culture really catalyzed the growth of the city into an international hub.
Yes.
And going back to the Freedom Tower, what I find somewhat poetic about the city is that you see the skyline of the city, which I think is the third largest metro skyline in the country. And you see all these new buildings that have, feel like they're coming up every 5 or 6 years. There's another super tall skyscraper. But the one thing that's not changed has been Freedom Tower in the downtown Miami skyline. And I think that's like a really beautiful remembrance to like everyone who made it possible for such a city to rise up.
It's really important as big a set of boosters as you have brought to this table, and all four of us are walking chambers of commerce for the place. There are housing issues. Affordability is a huge issue. Transportation, my God, it is an awful problem because it's so narrow and so many people, hundreds of thousands of people.
Everybody wants to be close to the beach.
Everybody wants to be close to the beach, and even if you don't want to be close to the beach, you're still stuck in traffic.
Right.
Climate change.
Climate change is a big one.
Whether you believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change, you cannot deny that the streets flood and that the water table is practically up to the surface, and it was not designed for this many people and this much construction. So we need to have technological solutions.
And Miami and South Florida is on the forefront of that battle with climate change. Hurricanes are getting stronger by the year. Regular rainstorms are really affecting how the city operates and does business. So it's really undeniable.
And Freedom Tower there's a $25 million renovation going on as we speak, and it's largely in response to being so close to the harbor, so close to the waterfront, and they know that they've got to protect the infrastructure. So most of that will not be visible. It's going to be the infrastructure of the building itself to protect it from future surges, et cetera.
Well, I look forward to a Miami where people are informed about the issues and about how things happen, how all of this climate change is happening. And we also have this phenomenal tech community that will look around and say, in order to preserve what we have built, we have got to find new tech solutions. And so the combination of being ground zero and having this fantastic new way of thinking, I think says we ought to look for answers here.
Yeah. It creates the biggest opportunity to respond to the challenge because it could provide a model for other at-risk cities and municipalities around the country on how to fight climate change and these challenges because we have to deal with them first because the problem is most severe in our backyard.
And so it's so interesting to listen to this conversation and see how the Cuban American community, which was very focused at one point and may still be focused in some ways on Cuba, on the path, on the revolution, on the response to the revolution, is looking forward so much in this country. That's an extraordinary.
But the people who are leading the community are second and third generations. I mean, with all due respect to Sam, who is not even as old as I am, and we're not talking about you either.
Thank you.
But
we're the young side of the table here.
We had our shot. It's AJ now who's got to figure all this out.
And
So
one
deal
thing
with
that
it.
is really interesting about all these things that are being discussed about technology solutions that are innovative, that provide a new way forward, is that the Cubans who came here and who couldn't go back because of what was happening in Cuba had to find new ways of surviving. They had to be innovative. They had to be audacious. They had to be bold. One of the reasons immigration is so important to this country: innovation, new ways of thinking, diversity, new ways of providing solutions. And I think that this is the reason Miami is such a wonderful city, because we have been able to meld all these different points of view, do it in a civil society, and at the same time provide this innovation and this new way of looking forward.
And so is there a change in consciousness as the generations become second, third, fourth generation? I know Carlos Herrera talks about his heart still being in Cuba. Many of the great Cuban writers, Cuban exile writers, talk about their hearts being in Cuba still. Is that changing? Is that a new generation?
I'd say among my generation, we want to go back just to see where our parents came from. There's this allure and this idea of Cuba based on the stories that we've heard, but we want to see it for ourselves. My grandmother can still give the directions from the Capitol building to her house on 10 de Octubre, on the road in Havana that she lived. And once communism ends, on the island, I want to go back there and retrace her steps. And it's very common with a lot of my friends and family.
This is when it will become evident once we are free again, hopefully within my lifetime. I think a lot of these young people will go back to help, will go back to establish businesses there. That doesn't mean they're going to establish their permanent residence there, but they have this emotional tie that we have created in them.
I have gone back. If my father had been alive, I think I wouldn't have gone. But I did. Well, and I'm glad I did, because it was a discovery. I don't know where anything is in Havana, but I never felt lost. That's the sense in which there's and I feel the same way about going back to Puerto Rico. But I am not in any way mistaken that I was raised here from childhood on. I am an American, and I visit there as a kind of cultural heritage issue. And language and spirit and so on, but I am an American, and there's no question at all in my mind.
We're very proud Americans, very proud
From
Americans.
my generation, maybe to you too, we remember two dates. One, the date we were born, and the date we left Cuba.
Right, right, that's right.
Yeah.